All right, so today's topic is going to be ventilation. So this is the single most critical aspect when installing a roof to make sure it doesn't go overlooked. Not having proper ventilation in an attic is going to greatly reduce the lifespan of a roof. So in today's video, I'm going to be covering technically two topics, but I'm going to be going pretty in depth with each one. Number one, what to look for, and then number two, I'm going to go over all the products. I even have my notepad handy with me today because it's just a lot to cover, and I want to make sure that I not only hit the basics but go into a lot of nuances when it comes into ventilation, the inspection, the products, the usages, when you're going to have exceptions that are also involved in that as well. So without further ado, number one, what to look for. This is all going to start when you do your initial inspection. So when you're coming out to a property, when you're doing the walk around, it's super important that you know how a roof breathes. Basic concept is when the wind blows, the wind is going to enter your soffit, which for those of you who may not know is essentially the overhang that extends out past the heated wall. And it's usually about 12 to 18 inches long on average. There's going to be some exceptions. If a home is much older, then that's where you run into the fact it has no soffit. But for all intents and purposes, most homes you're going to run into are going to have a built soffit. When the wind blows, air goes into the soffit and then it expels out through whatever kind of exhaust you have. And that's how the roof breathes. And it's super critical to make sure that it's breathing properly to ensure the warranty on the roof is actually going to hold up so you don't have any issues in the future. So during that inspection, I'm going to walk around, I'm going to look at my soffits, and I'm going to check, number one, do you have a soffit? Two, what kind of intake does it have? Does it look like it has proper intake for the amount of attic space that you have? Because there's a couple different styles, which I won't dive into. You just want to see if it's perforated, if it's punched, anything along those lines, if it has vents, kind of similar to what would be on the inside of your home when your AC is running. And then I will say, when you do look at an older home and it doesn't have a soffit, that's a pretty important thing to note because a lot of the times the attic doesn't breathe properly. And if that is the case, then you may need to make some adjustments when you go to using the product for the exhaust. Also, when you're looking at other structures, a lot of those don't have attic spaces. So sometimes they'll only have a small piece of ridge vent or they just won't breathe at all. And to be honest with you, if you don't have an intake, there's really not a whole lot of sense in having an exhaust on that roof. One thing I do want to note when you're checking the soffit, this happens a lot. So when you have intake that is just perforated, sometimes it's a small strip. Perforated meaning it has holes all throughout it. Those holes can be sometimes pretty small, and when that is the case, if the home has just been repainted, it's something that a homeowner especially, you may want to check and make sure that when they painted, they didn't put it on too thick, that way it's clogging the perforation, and then now the attic isn't breathing properly. Once you get up on the roof, you want to take note of how that roof is shaped, because depending on how that roof is shaped, if it's more of just a pyramid style where it has 4 hips to go to the top, it may not have a long ridge. Or it may have a bunch of ridge, and for the amount of attic space that is there, you may not need to have the ridge extend all the way to each ends. So depending on how the roof is designed, that's also going to play a pretty big role in what kind of exhaust and how much exhaust you're able to put up on that roof to make sure you're getting that proper ventilation. The material type of the roof can also make a difference, whether it's shingles, whether it's metal, whether it's tile. A lot of those are going to factor into what kind of exhaust you want to put on the roof as well, because a general rule of thumb, most metal roofs are usually just going to have a ridge vent as long as there's enough ridge there. And some of those other more tougher materials to deal with, like your tiles and your cedar shakes, you don't really want to put a bunch of what we call louvers up there. Number one, because the more penetrations you have in a roof, the more opportunity there is going to be for a leak. But also having a bunch of cuts, those materials are a little bit harder to manipulate than just running a razor blade against your shingles. Second thing I want to dive into is the product. Going back to how the roof is designed is going to play a big part. Now, I'm going to lay out a couple different common products that you're going to see when you look up at your roof. Some of these are going to be hidden on the back. You may only be able to see them when you're actually up on the roof. Not saying one is necessarily better than the other, but they all play their own roles in properly ventilating an attic. I'm going to go over the pros and cons of each one, so that way you can better determine, and so can your roofing contractor, what may be the best solution for you. And I'll start with the most common ones, which is going to be your louvers. So there's a few different variety of these. You'll see old school ones that are pretty big, and then you'll see smaller, more modern ones that are called slant back vents, which are only about 6 to 18 inches wide. So pros of these, it's a cheaper product, it's a pretty low cost to install, and it also is non-mechanical, so it will never stop working. The downside, which is typically why we never opt for this product, is because it takes so much to ventilate a large space that you normally cannot put enough up on a roof, and if you do, it starts to look a little ridiculous. An average roof, say 30 squares, most calculations are going to bring you up to around 20 louvers, which is going to look crazy on a roof. So normally when I see this product on a roof, it's just not having enough exhaust to be ventilated properly. Not only that, when you have 30 holes in your roof, it's just a lot more susceptible for leaking, and I see it from time to time. Second product I want to go over is something called a power vent. So these are going to look like essentially a turtle shell on your roof. The pros of these are very good. If it's a roof where you don't have enough ridges, which is that peak that goes along the top, this can be a solution. It's essentially where the roof is shaped a little bit more like a pyramid, where you have 4 hips going to the top. This may be a good option if you have a large attic space floor, but you don't have a lot of ridge at the top. So the pros to these is it does have an adjustable thermostat. It is a very, like it says, powerful unit. It doesn't rely on the natural wind for it to be able to ventilate the attic. And one of the cool options that a lot of people go for is it actually has a solar option, to where it has a solar panel built into the back. Tricky with this is obviously if you don't get enough solar throughout the day, then it's probably not going to benefit you. The cons with this product, and why we only opt to use it if it's something where we can't get enough ridge vent on the roof, is really that they usually break after several years. Most of the time when we go to replace a roof that has a power vent on it, it's already stopped working by then. So I typically want to steer away from things that are not mechanical. On top of that, because it is a power unit, if you don't have a solar option, it's definitely going to increase the cost of operating it, which is going to increase your utility bill a good bit. One other thing that you may want to know is if it's something you have to add to the home and it's not a solar unit to where it's going to be cordless. If it is corded, that is something where not every roofing contractor is going to be comfortable actually running wires through your attic to get that thing hooked up. So that's something you may also want to consider, making it a little bit more of a higher upfront cost for installation if it doesn't already exist on the home. Third product I'm going to talk about, which you don't see a whole lot in Georgia, is something called turbines. A lot of people call them whirlybirds as well. So the pros to these is it does work very well if you're in a high wind area. The upfront install is pretty low. It is a pretty cheap product in general, and all you're doing is cutting a hole in the roof decking and slapping it on. The cons to this product are obviously if it works well in really high wind areas. When it's in a not so windy area, or if the wind is just not blowing very hard, it's just not doing a fantastic job of moving that hot air out of the attic space. Similar to a louver, if you have a very big attic space, this is a product you're going to have several units on the roof to make sure it's ventilated properly. And out of all the products I'm talking about, it's probably the least aesthetic looking. It's just not very pleasant. It's a pretty bulky piece of metal. Doesn't really blend in with the roofing system. Fourth most common one I'm going to go over is what we typically use for a couple reasons, and that's going to be ridge vent. This is normally our go-to, and I'll kind of describe why. The pros are it's a very effective way of moving hot air out of the attic. It's like it describes, ridge vent sits all the way at the peaks, and as most of you know, hot air is going to rise, so it's going to expel the heat at the highest point of the attic. A lot of times when I'm doing an inspection and I'm looking down a home that has ridge vent, I'm going to see that heat just pouring out of it, which is great. Also non-mechanical, which I love. So just like the louvers, it will never stop working regardless of how windy the conditions are. One other thing that's a really good high point about it is it's generally very clean look. It's a very aesthetically pleasing. It lays on top. You only see about an inch of plastic or composite from the bottom, and then your hip and ridge shingles will just lay on top, making a nice finished look. The only aesthetic thing I will say about it, there can be a little bit of preference. when you run the ridge vent all the way to the sides of the full ridge length. I don't recommend this, and I always talk to homeowners that have it before, because the ridge vent is truly never cut all the way open underneath the ridge all the way to the edges, because then it would become more susceptible to leaking. So when the ridge vent does go all the way to the edges, you're just putting a product over the shingles. It's not actually serving as a function. So whenever you see our roofs, the Douglas construction, they're going to stop at least a foot short. Some of the cons of ridge vent is if it doesn't exist on a home, the upfront install is going to be a little bit higher. And why is that? So if a home doesn't have ridge vent, the way we install it, when we remove the hip and ridge shingles that are sitting on top, depending on how close that framing is with the decking, if it touches or if it's only about a ½ inch, we have to drop a skill saw on there and cut it open. Depending on if you have a center beam or not, that's going to change the requirements of how wide it has to be. But we're going to have to cut that open, and then we're going to have to put the ridge vent down. So it's going to be a little more labor intensive, and that's going to add up to a little bit more of an upfront cost. One other nuance to this product is you cannot install it on a pitch that is less than a 312. On top of that, you also can't install it on a roof that has something called a cathedral or a vaulted ceiling. So all that means is if you look up inside your home and you don't have an attic space above that ceiling, that is not something you can use for a ridge vent. You need to find another form of exhaust to make sure that if there is a hard straight line wind, rain is not going to drop down that rafter and it's going to leak. In summary, there's a lot of things to consider, but I can't stress this enough. Ventilation is one of the most critical components of the roofing system. Making sure an attic is properly ventilated and having that discussion is going to separate the pros from the amateurs, and it's going to separate a 30-year shingle from lasting 10 to lasting as long as it actually should, which is closer to 20 to 25 years. Thanks for watching, guys.